Vivekachudamani. Now I am going to tell you about the real nature of the Supreme Self, by realizing which man attains liberation and is freed from bondage. That realization of I is indeed the Self, which is experienced as I, shining of its own accord, the Absolute. Being the witness of three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep, distinct from the five sheaths, aware of the mental modes in the waking and dream states, and of their absence in the state of deep sleep. That self sees all of its own accord, but is never seen by any of these. It gives light to the intellect and ego, but is not enlightened by them. It pervades the universe, and by its light, all this insentient universe is illumined. But the universe does not pervade it, even to the slightest extent. In its presence, the body, senses, mind, and intellect enter upon their functions as if commanded by it. By that unbroken knowledge, all things from the ego to the body, objects and our experience of them, occur and are perceived. By it, life and the various organs are set in motion. That inner self, as the primeval spirit, eternal, ever effulgent, full and infinite bliss, single, indivisible, whole and living, shines in everyone as the witnessing awareness. That self in its splendor, shining in the cavity of the heart as the subtle, pervasive, yet unmanifest ether, illumines this universe like the sun. It is aware of the modifications of the mind and ego, of the actions of the body, sense organs, and life breath. It takes their form as fire does that of a heated ball of iron, yet it undergoes no change in doing so. This self is neither born nor dies. It neither grows nor decays, nor does it suffer any change. When a pot is broken, the space inside it is not, and similarly when the body dies, the self in it remains eternal. It is distinct from the causal Maya and its effects. It is pure knowledge. It illumines being and non-being alike, and is without attributes. It is the witness of the intellect in the waking, dream, and deep sleep states. It shines as I, as ever present, direct experience. Know that Supreme Self by means of a one-pointed mind, and know this I is Brahman. Thus, through the intellect, you may know the Self in yourself, by yourself, and by this means cross the ocean of birth and death and become one who has achieved his life purpose and ever remains as the Self. Mistaking the body or not I for the Self or I is the cause of all misery, that is, of all bondage. This bondage comes through ignorance of the cause of birth and death, for it is through ignorance that men regard these insentient bodies as real, mistaking them for self, and sustaining them with sense objects, and finally getting destroyed by them, just as the silkworm protects itself by the threads that it emits, but is finally destroyed by them. For those who mistake the rope for a serpent, the integral pure effulgence of this pristine state is veiled by tamas, just as the dragon's head covers the sun in an eclipse, and as a result, the spirit Purusha forgets his reality. He is devoured by the dragon of delusion and mistaking the non-self for the self, is overpowered by mental states and submerged in the fathomless ocean of samsara, full of the poison of sense enjoyments, and now sinking, now rising, he finds no way of escape. Such are the torments caused by the projecting power of rajas together with the veiling of tamas. Just as the layers of clouds caused by the rays of the sun increase until they hide the sun itself, so the bondage of ego caused by ignorance in the self expands until it hides that very self. Just as frost and cold winds torment one on a wintry day when the sun is hidden by clouds, so too, when tamas covers the self, the projecting power of rajas deludes the ignorant into mistaking the non-self for the self and torments them with many sorrows. So it is by these two powers alone that the self has been brought into bondage. Of this tree of samsara, tamas is the seed, the I am the body idea is the shoot, desire is the young leaf, activity the water that makes it grow, the body the trunk, a man's successive lives the branches, the sense organs the twigs, sense objects the flowers, and diverse sorrows caused by activity the fruit. The ego is the bird sitting in the tree and enjoying its fruit. This bondage of the non-self, born of ignorance, causing endless sorrow through birth, death, and old age, is without beginning, yet its complete destruction can be brought about in the way that I will tell you. Have faith in the Vedas and perform all the actions prescribed by them without seeking for any gain from doing so. This will give you purity of mind. With this pure mind, meditate incessantly, and by doing so, you will directly know the self. This self-knowledge is the keen sword that cuts asunder the bonds. No other weapon or contrivance is capable of destroying them, nor wind, nor fire, nor countless actions. The self is covered over by the five sheaths caused by the power of ignorance. It is hidden from sight like the water of a pond covered with weeds. When the weeds are removed, the water is revealed and can be used by man to quench his thirst and cool him from the heat. In the same way, by process of elimination, you should with keen intellect discard the objective five sheaths from the self as not this, not this. Know the self distinct from the body and from all forms, like a stalk of grass in its sheath of leaf. Know it as eternal, pure, single in its essence, unattached, with no duties to perform, ever blissful and self-effulgent. He who is liberated realizes that all objective reality, which is superimposed on the self as the idea of a serpent is on the rope, is really no other than the self, and he himself is the self. Therefore, the wise aspirant should undertake discrimination between the self and the non-self. Of the five sheaths, Panchakoshas, food, life breath, mind, intellect, and bliss, The gross body is created out of food, increasing by eating it and perishing when there is none. It is the sheath of food, compounded of skin, blood, flesh, fat, marrow, excreta, and urine. It is mostly filthy. It has no existence before birth or after death, but appears between them. It undergoes change every moment. There is no set law governing that change. It is an object, like a pot, is insentient and has a variety of forms. It is acted upon by other forces. The self, on the other hand, is distinct from this body and is single, eternal, and pure. It is indestructible, though the body with its limbs is destroyed. The self is the witness who knows the characteristics of the body, its modes of activity, and its three states. It is self-aware and directs the body. Such being the contrast between the body and the self, how can the body be the self? The fool thinks of it as the self. The man of wise action, with some measure of discrimination, takes body and soul together for I. But the really wise man, who conducts the inquiry with firm discrimination, knows himself always as a supreme Brahman, the being which is of its own nature. The I am the body idea is the seed of all sorrow. Therefore, just as you do not identify yourself with your shadow body, image body, dream body, or the body that you have in your imagination, cease also to associate the self in any way with the body of skin, flesh, and bones. Make every effort to root out this error, and holding fast to the knowledge of reality as the absolute Brahman, destroy the mind and obtain supreme peace. Then you will have no more births. Even a learned scholar who perfectly understands the meaning of Vedanta has no hope of liberation if, owing to delusion, he cannot give up the idea of the non-existent body as the self. Now we come to the vital body of prana, which is the life breath with the 5 organs of action. The aforementioned sheath of food enters upon its course of activity when filled by this vital force. It is nothing but a modification of air, and like air, it enters into the body and comes out of it. It does not know its own desires and antipathies or those of others. It is eternally dependent on the self. Therefore, the vital body cannot be the self. The mental sheath is the mind with its organs of knowledge. This is the cause of the wrong concept of the self as I and mine. It is very powerful, being endowed with diversity of thought forms, beginning with the I thought. It fills and pervades the vital sheath. The ever-blazing fire of the mental sheath is consuming this whole world, lit by the 5 sense organs as sacrificial priest, fed by sense objects as the fuel, and kept ablaze by the latent tendencies. There is no ignorance apart from the mind. It is the cause of the bondage of birth and death. With the emergence of mind, everything arises, and with its subsidence, everything ceases. In the dream state, in which there are no objects, the mind creates its dream world of enjoyers and others by its own powers. Similarly, all that it perceives in the waking state is its own display. It is the experience of all that nothing appears when the mind subsides in deep sleep. Therefore, The bondage of samsara is only superimposed on the self by the mind. Actually, it has no reality. Just as the wind gathers the clouds in the sky and then disperses them, so the mind causes the bondage, but also causes liberation. The mind first creates in man an attachment to the body and to all sense objects, with the result that he is bound by his attachment like a beast tethered by a rope. Under the influence of rajas and tamas, it is enfeebled and entangles man in desire for the body and objects. But under the influence of sattva, it breaks away from rajas and tamas and attains to non-attachment and discrimination and rejects sense objects as though they were poison. Therefore, the wise seeker after liberation must first establish himself in discrimination and desirelessness. The mind is a great tiger roaming wild in the huge jungle of sense objects. Therefore, aspirants should keep away from it. It is only the mind that conjures up before the self subtle and gross objects and all the variations of body, caste, and station in life, qualities and action, causes and effects. So doing, it tempts and deludes the self, which is really unattached, pure intelligence, binding it by the qualities of body, senses, and life, and deluding it with the idea of I and mine in the fruits of action that it creates. By means of this false representation, the mind creates the myth of samsara, bondage for the spirit. This is the primal cause of the sorrow of birth and death, which binds those who are subject to the faults of rajas and tamas and lack discrimination. Just as cloud masses revolve through the air, so does the whole world revolve through the delusion of the mind. Therefore, those who know reality declare that the mind is ignorance. He who seeks liberation must examine his mind by his own efforts, and once the mind is purified by such introspection, liberation is obtained and appears obvious and natural. Out of desire for liberation, you should root out all other desires, renounce activity, and take to perpetual preoccupation with truth, Shravana Manana, which will lead on to the perpetual meditation Nididhyasana. Then alone can the waves of the mind be stilled. Therefore, even this mind sheath cannot be the real self, since it has a beginning and an end, and is subject to modifications and characterized by pain and grief, and is an object of perception. The intellect, with the five organs of knowledge, is the Vijnanmaya sheath and is also the cause of bondage for the spirit. It is a modification of the unmanifest, beginningless self, which has assumed the form of the ego and conducts all activities through the reflected light of consciousness. It is the conscious agent of activity, and its attributes are intelligence and actions. It regards the body and senses as I, and their modes of life, duties, actions, and qualities as mine. It performs good or evil actions as dictated by its previous tendencies, and as a result of these actions attains to higher or lower regions and wanders there until it is attracted to rebirth in some enticing womb. It experiences the states of waking, dream, and deep sleep, and the pleasant and painful fruits of its actions. Within this sheath of knowledge, the self throbs as the self-effulgent light, the supreme soul, homogeneous, the truth, all-pervasive, complete, immutable, the supreme Lord. Yet the self assumes limitations through the false superimposition of the intellect on its in this sheath, because this is close to it, and in fact the closest of its adjuncts. As a result, it is deluded into thinking that it is this sheath. Just as a pot might seem to be different from its clay, so it imagines itself to be different from itself, to be the agent and the enjoyer, and seems to be limited in such ways, although it is like the fire in a ball of hot iron, unaffected by the shape of the ball. In answer to the Guru, the disciple says, Master, I accept your statement that, whether through delusion or not, the Supreme Self has come to regard itself as the ego. But since this superimposition of the ego concept is beginningless, it cannot be supposed to have an end either. How then can there be liberation? But if there is no liberation, the ego concept becomes eternal, and bondage also becomes eternal. Pray, enlighten me on this point. To this, the Master replies, That is a good question, my learned disciple. Now listen with one pointed mind to my explanation. Whatever has been conjured up by delusion must be examined in the pure light of reason. Things appear real as long as the delusion lasts, and perish as unreal and non existent as soon as it passes. Just like illusion of a serpent seen in a piece of rope and appearing real as long as the illusion lasts, really the self is unattached, actionless, characterless, immutable, formless, being, consciousness, bliss, the inner witness. It has no sort of relationship with anything. To think that it has is a mere delusion, like the appearance of blue in the sky. The false attitude of the ego to the self is due to the relationship with the beginningless false vehicle. But even this sense of relationship is the result of delusion. Although this attitude of the ego to the self is without a beginning, that does not make it real. Just as water becomes clear as soon as the dirt is removed from it, so is it with the self when the effects of the ego and its false adjuncts are dropped from it, and ignorance disappears through discrimination between self and non-self. Then appears the true self-effulgent knowledge of the oneness of God and the self. The discarding of the beginningless ignorance with its cause and effects and bodies and states is like the ending of the beginningless non-existence, or the ending of a dream when the waking state supervenes. Liberation from the bondage of the false ego concept can never come about except through knowledge acquired by discrimination between the self and the non-self. Therefore, you also must discriminate in order to remove the non-existent ego. Even this intellectual sheath is subject to change, insentient, a part of a whole, and an object of perception, and therefore it cannot be the Atma. Can the non-eternal ever become eternal? Coming now to the sheath of bliss, this is only a modification of ignorance on which the Supreme Self is reflected. It reveals itself at will in all three states, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, and yields the different modes of bliss from perceiving, obtaining, and experiencing things. It is experienced effortlessly by all to some extent in deep sleep, but sadhus who have practiced discrimination experience the bliss of it perpetually without effort and its fullness in the deep sleep state. However, even this sheath of bliss cannot be the Supreme Self, since it is subject to change and possesses attributes. It is the effect of past good deeds and the modification of Prakriti and it abides in the other sheaths, which are themselves also modifications. If by the rejection of false ideas all five sheaths are eliminated, the self alone is experiences I. It alone remains whole and self aware, distinct from the five sheaths, the witness of the three states, self effulgent, immutable, untainted, everlasting bliss. It is like Devadatta, a name taken simply as an illustration, who neither is the pot nor partakes of its nature, but is only the witness. The self is not the five sheaths, which are objects, nor does it partake of their nature, but is a mere witness of them.